Hello, everybody. This is Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business in London. I'm on a Skype call with Nityanand and Jayaraman, who is in Chennai in India, where he is a social activist who has worked on environmental and social causes for a long time. He is also a journalist, and he has been working on many of the issues that are at the heart of the conflicts and the challenges between corporations and communities in India. Nityanand, thank you for joining us. As I
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And as I said in my earlier when we were talking, that this month, June, is the month when we are now 5 years into the Human Rights Council's quite historic unanimous adoption of the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. Has that made any difference? Has anything changed if you were to look back?
Well, I think that from a ground up, I don't see much that has changed. In fact, if anything, in the last 5 years, I've seen things getting worse, particularly in India, where the complicity of the state and the corporate sector in violating human rights in various forms has intensified. And also, what I've seen is the protections for human rights and environment. Environment being a very critical factor in determining human rights in India. Both these kinds of protection for both labor, human rights, and environment has been chipped away at the behest of the corporate sector. So I could say I have seen change, but the change is not for the better, as might have been expected at the time that the council adopted the principles.
Right. You raised a couple of very interesting points. One is the issue of complicity, which is, of course, contributing to or benefiting from a particular abuse. And the principle does rest on, the state and the corporate sector, because the principles talk about the state duty to protect, corporate responsibility to respect, and the need for remedy. So let's break it up one by one. With the state duty to protect, do you think the state, and in our case, we are talking about India, is abdicating its responsibility, or is it in this desire to have development and jobs, and therefore it's willing to clear? Is it the state driving the process, or do you think it's the companies that are driving the process?
Well, I think that it is not a company, but it is the corporate sector. It's a financial sector, and just the rights of finance of money to move and to decide things far outweighs the rights of people or the environment. And so I would say that globally there seems to be a push that is making all countries, including the industrialized countries, respond more sensitively to the needs and the challenges faced by capital than the needs and challenges faced by people. So what we are seeing is systematically that government, particularly in my country, the government is replacing, alienating people from their access to infrastructure, natural infrastructure, to the commons, and replacing these infrastructures of survival with the infrastructure for big commerce to survive. So I think that the state, and when I say the state does this, the state is doing it on behalf of somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And the state seems to be justifying it by redefining its responsibility as saying that the responsibility is to develop. Development will come through growth. Growth will come through industrialization, and industrialization will come through corporate investments.
Right.
It is a very linear, single kind of. It blocks off any possible alternatives, any possible other ways of imagining our future.
And what it also misses, if I read you correctly, is the idea that all these steps may be desirable in an ideal way, but can only be done if in the process rights are not harmed. And your point is that rights are being harmed and that is being ignored.
No, I'm saying that if you define development as only coming through growth, and growth only
Right.
through industrialization,
Right.
and industrialization only through corporate investments, then I think that harm is guaranteed. You cannot do it any other way, because it negates the possibility of any other way to exist, and therein there is a inherent violence. It negates the possibility of a different person to say, I define my well-being in a different manner. Let's assume there is an indigenous community
Yes.
that believes that coal or bauxite that remains under the ground is what prosperity for posterity is all about. And there's another civilizational point of view that says there is only one way of looking at it, and for that there has to be growth, and for growth the coal and the bauxite has to come out.
Right.
So I think one negates the other.
Right.
And there I think that you cannot respect the human rights of the communities that you're going to kick out. You can bribe them, you can browbeat them, but you cannot respect their rights or their vision or their aspirations.
Now, that's very interesting that you use the phrase of respecting human rights, because that is the responsibility of companies. And, probably a few dozen and maybe a few hundred companies now swear by the UN guiding principles. At least they talk about them, and they say that we do intend to respect human rights, and they talk about the respect framework of, operationalizing a policy, doing the due diligence, and so on. What have you seen in practical terms? And here I want to also reflect about specific experiences in India, because you have companies which have started talking about the guiding principles. Has it gone beyond statements?
I don't think it is meant to go beyond statements to any serious change, because you must understand that you definitely know that the guiding principles have been are what has been offered as ersatz, as a kind of a substitute, a very poor substitute for a legally binding instrument.
Mm-hmm.
What was asked for was a legally binding instrument. The same corporations that are coming forward enthusiastically to produce nice, beautiful looking, glossy brochures about their sustainability were also the ones who are fighting against a legally binding instrument.
Right.
When we can have a legally binding instrument to protect the right for free trade, I don't see why there should not be a legally binding instrument for protection of human rights. If there can be a WTO for free trade, why not have a World Human Rights Organization as a national convention that imposes very serious penalties?
Now, by looking at that, you're talking about penalties, which is where the issue of remedies comes in. And the third part of the guiding principles is indeed remedy. This is a very relevant issue in India. I mean, you have recently had success in the whole Unilever campaign, and very briefly you can describe what happened. But I also want you to reflect on Bhopal and the ongoing struggle for at least the water contamination part of it, and the responsibility of Dow, on which for which the activist community, the victims themselves, have been campaigning for a very long time.
Yeah, both in the case of Unilever and in Union Carbide and Dow Chemical, where the campaigns are still ongoing, it exposes the fact that there are no effective mechanisms for remedy that have been set up by the state or facilitated by the corporate sector. On the contrary, what it clearly shows is that if there is anything that can be called success that comes out in this, it has been despite the corporate sector, despite the state, despite the international organizations, the multilateral and the bilateral organizations that have been set up to protect human rights and to protect the environment. I mean, one of the things that has been said in the guiding principles is that states must not erect barriers.
Mm-hmm.
But what we see is that the entire judicial system is a barrier.
Mm-hmm.
It is inaccessible. If you manage to access it, the terms of the fight inside the courtroom are heavily loaded. On the one hand, you have a multinational that can throw a lot of money at scientists, at lawyers, and probably whatever else that happens behind the scenes. And you have, on the other hand, the victims of Bhopal or the victims of Kodaikanal, who are required to prove by demonstrating their body as evidence at every step of the way. So it's a humiliating, indignifying way of dealing with this. And the longer the settlement gets drawn out, the more indignity, the more humility that the workers or the victims have to suffer. I've seen that in the UK, in the US, and in India. It is difficult to bring, right now, it is difficult to bring cases against companies in their home territories. Sitting elsewhere. If I want to go to the UK, the costs are prohibitive to access the courts to say take a case against Vedanta or Unilever. And right now we are facing a situation where the states are actively subverting the process of law. Dow Chemical is required to present itself in the Bhopal court on July 16th, 2016. This is the fourth time it is being summoned. The summons have not been even handed over to Dow Chemicals by the US Department of Justice. If the US Department of Justice has any respect for law, it would at least hand over the summons that has been issued by another sovereign country.
Right.
That has not happened. And so now we have to have a White House petition that requires 100,000 signatures to be gathered within 30 days. Everything is happening, if you notice, outside. I mean, it's happening in the court of public opinion, not in the legal infrastructure that's been set up by the state at my expense.
Just for us, the sake of our listeners who may not be familiar with all the cases, very briefly, the Bhopal story I can narrate that in December 1984 there was this leak of methyl isocyanate from the plant, and at least 2 to 3,000 people died immediately, and over the years, at least 10,000, perhaps even closer to 20,000 people have either lost lives or their lives have been affected in the process, and chemicals have been stored within the plant, which have in effect ended up underground at the underground level, contaminated the city's water supply, which is the fight that the communities and activists are fighting now. Can you describe the Unilever case very briefly? Yeah, for
The Unilever
those
case
of
is
our
it's a
listeners who don't know.
second-hand thermometer factory that was exported from Watertown in New York
Yes.
in the mid 80s, subsequently inherited by Hindustan Unilever and Unilever PLC. The factory operated for 18 years in a hill town in Tamil Nadu in southern India, and over a period of 18 years, it has spewed mercury into the ecologically sensitive, hydrologically sensitive forests around the factory site. Several workers who were exposed to mercury, and many of them are showing signs of mercury poisoning. In 2011, a Government of India committee found that workers had been exposed, and many of them are indeed suffering from contamination. The fight has been happening from 2001 to 2016 till now, requiring Unilever to compensate affected workers and to clean up the environment. The compensation of affected workers came to a successful resolution in March 2016 when Hindustan Unilever settled with about 590 workers.
Mm-hmm.
This was a result not of the Indian court or the goodness of heart of Unilever, but it was a result of its sustained campaign, which culminated with a very vigorous social media campaign.
Right.
Basically, this was corporate social responsibility triggered by a takeoff on a Nicki Minaj song called Kodaikanal Won't. It is a rap song sung by a Chennai rapper, and this resulted in a massive amount of public outrage, which finally culminated in a settlement. The environmental issue, where remediation of the contaminated site has still not been resolved, the company continues to maintain that it will only clean up to a standard that is about 20 times weaker than the residential standard in the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And we are asking for something that is far more stringent than the residential standards, because the factory is located inside a wildlife, it's surrounded by a wildlife sanctuary.
Right. Thanks very much. That was very helpful. One final question is that one of the things that the adherents of the guiding principles say, that one good thing about the guiding principles is that they are forcing companies to reflect on the risks that they are posing to communities and to human rights and take steps to mitigate the risk. Of course, one of the cornerstones of human rights is that in many instances you want zero tolerance. You cannot offset a human rights abuse in one place by doing good elsewhere. I mean, it doesn't really fall into the cost-benefit scenario. And the principles do recognize that there are certain no-go areas. Now, assuming that that's a good starting point, what more would you like to see? If the end point is a treaty, and which may take between 10 years, 5 years, I don't know, UN treaties take quite a long time to negotiate. And it depends on what the treaty is about. I mean, we haven't even started discussing that. In that kind of a context, what are the incremental steps you would like to see over the next few years?
I really don't know. This is a very kind of a loaded question, because it asks me to make an assumption that I'm not willing to make. I cannot subscribe to the assumption that this is a good first step, because the good first step would have been a legally binding treaty, and from there we could have made it stronger. But what we've done now is to weaken it and then try to figure out how we can be happy with this. I'm not happy with this because I believe that the use of the word forcing companies to reflect on the risk. There's no forcing in this. Companies that want to do it can do it. Companies that don't want to do it don't have to do it.
Right.
There is nobody who can tell them do it or else. There is no or else.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So considering that, this is not about the whole problem is that we are not in a situation globally to be able to force corporations to do anything, even if it is doing good or in obeying the law. And therein lies a problem. We have created an artificial entity called the corporate sector that is above our control, that is beyond our control. And the way to be able to change this, the lead up to the treaty or whatever, is to be able to break down the corporate power so that they can be subject to control by states, by communities, etc. And if we were to do that, then the corporation would no longer be called a corporation. So in my mind, just as when there was a fight against slavery, we were not talking about responsible slavery and responsible slave owners. We're talking about an abolition. I think that the same should also apply over here. We need a structure that can do business without harming human rights, without hurting the consumers, without hurting the shareholders, without hurting the environment, and without hurting the workers or the community.
Thank you very much. That's a very powerful note to end on. Thanks very much indeed.